So this week, we're really going to introduce to the idea of supervision and performance evaluation as it relates to the state of Pennsylvania. I do want to give credit for most of these slides, Dr. Maria Schwab, who teaches in the program and has shared these with me, and I kind of added some information to them and certainly going to add my own narration as we go. So this week, really, we're focused on getting all of you to really understand the difference between supervision, evaluation, and discipline. They are not the same, and sometimes teachers associate supervision and evaluation as one, and often lump in discipline with supervision. The three are very separate, yet they can go in tandem with one another depending on the employee's performance. Want to investigate components of the framework for teaching. So this week's reading is focused on the chapters from Danielson's professional practice text, and then really set you up to prepare for completing observation 1, which is not due for another, I think, 2 weeks. It'll be due somewhere in April. You can see here, as I said, they are definitely separate components to evaluating and supervising and disciplining teachers. Obviously, if you are in the need of disciplining a teacher, you're going to need to have some ongoing supervision as it relates to helping them increase or better their performance, as well as that's ultimately going to lead to information on an evaluation. But one of the things as a newer administrator, sometimes we tend to go from the disciplinary act to evaluation without really providing guidance and support as part of supervision along the way. The goal is always, when we're supervising staff and evaluating them, the goal is always to improve practice, and it shouldn't be about being punitive or looking to get a teacher, particularly ones that as an administrator you may not always agree with or see their methods as beneficial in your school. And what I would say to you is, if you come across those teachers, really work to understand who they are as teachers. Try to find a way to respect their position and try to approach supervising them with the sense of how can you gain their trust to slowly, make improvements to the program using their kind of philosophy and approach. Oops, So evaluation. So let's talk about who does the evaluation. So you can see administrators, principals, superintendents, supervisors. They are summative assessments. That's really important. It's kind of the end of a year where you're going to evaluate a faculty member. Now, if you are a non-tenured teacher, you are being evaluated mid-year and end of year. So again, an untenured teacher or a long-term sub, if they're there for the year, will be given an evaluation twice, January and the end of the year, typically, mid and end of year. It is mandated. There's typically a policy. So if you are not familiar with your own district's policies around supervision evaluation, you should become familiar with those. In the state of Pennsylvania, they use the 82-1 and the 82-3. So the 82-1 is an evaluation given to all instructional teachers, so those people who have students on a regular basis. An 82-3 is typically given to people like nurses, guidance counselors, an academic coach, those who aren't necessarily seeing students on a regular basis. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. You are really looking at instructional skills as well as their ability to follow procedures, their following deadlines, things that they do in support of the whole school program. The goal, obviously, in the state of Pennsylvania is that if you have an unsatisfactory teacher, that you are screening out those people from either certification or hiring based on evaluating them appropriately. In the past, we made the change in the state of Pennsylvania to the 82-1 in the attempt to identify teachers more accurately as it reflects in our test scores. So years back, the state's looking at reports saying, we're pretty much everybody is satisfactory on the old PDE 426 or the 428. And so the state's looking at the test scores and thinking the test scores don't match the number of satisfactory teachers in the state of Pennsylvania. And so that's when they moved towards 82-1, which now includes building level data. It includes teacher-specific data if you are teaching a tested subject for 3 or more years. And the third component that is part of the 82-1 is then teacher-specific rating, which is an SLO, which the teachers choose local assessment to measure and receive a score. All of the scores on the evaluation are either a 0, 1, 2, or 3, with a 1.5 being the lowest score you can get to be still satisfactory. If you go below 1.5, you then fall into the needs improvement. If you end up in a needs improvement twice in the course of 10 years, that is grounds for an unsatisfactory rating for a teacher. So while the state has moved to the 82-1 and the 82-3 in an attempt to remove incompetent or unproductive teachers, the truth of the matter is, depending on the school district and the building score received, it's really hard to actually have a teacher show up as needs improvement unless you're really looking at their instructional performance in the classroom as being incompetent. So there are a set of standards for the administrators to follow, and that directly relates to the Danielson framework. And if I can just kind of pause here. So when you think about an evaluation of a teacher, I want you to picture a piece of graph paper, and that graph paper has lots of points and intersecting lines. So that's a teacher's full year. A teacher is, observed. There's informal feedback from parents, parent-teacher night, there's after-school activities, faculty meetings, paperwork. All that stuff really contributes towards a teacher's overall evaluation. An observation, and I'm going to get to this in a second, an observation is one point on that graph paper. So it's one piece of evidence that contributes towards a teacher's evaluation. And it shouldn't ever be the sole source of evidence that contributes to a teacher's evaluation. Let me restate that. An observation is one data point on a piece of graph paper. An evaluation is the entire graph paper. So when we talk about discipline, who really would be responsible for that? And this is where we would get our HR administrators typically involved. And this would be steps taken to kind of punish a professional staff resulting from some violation. Really needs to be progressive. So it starts with a verbal warning, and then it moves to a written warning, and then it moves along the continuum. So ultimately, you are probably having a teacher on a plan of improvement, at which point they are either meeting that plan and being successful. And by the way, the plan should always be about helping the teacher become successful, or they're not. And at that point, then you're moving towards a needs improvement or a failing, depending on the domain that you're looking at. However, there are things that are egregious enough that are not related to incompetence in the classroom. And that would be things like insubordination and things that would hurt or harm children or other adults. So there are sometimes situations where you are giving progressive discipline based on a teacher action that is severe enough to warrant it. So I'll use an example. I had a teacher, and please, keep this confidential, who had duct taped a kid's mouth shut, thinking it was funny. It ended up making the news, and the teacher did receive disciplinary action immediately. And sometimes that would involve administrative leave for a period of time, a suspension, a letter in the file, and hopefully something like that wouldn't happen again. However, there are some teachers who have a difficult time changing certain behaviors. There have been many things on the news in the past few years related to teacher misconduct with students, and certainly those things would warrant suspensions, terminations, or at the state level, once those things are reported, there's a revocation of licensure. However, that does take a long time. So in the hiring of teachers, you really need to make sure you're vetting them so that you're not hiring someone who is leaving another district under a suspension or termination, and the state hasn't necessarily followed up to revoke the license as of yet. And we know why. Obviously, we are disciplining if we need to. And finally, supervision, right? So this is really where we want to engage our teachers in conversations around improving practice, right? And so you really need to work to create a common vision for what teaching and learning looks like. So when you're a new administrator in a building, in a district, or someone who's supervising teachers from a district level, you really want to make sure that before you start observing teachers, that you've established that common vision. What does it look like to teach social studies at a high school in your district? What does it look like to engage students in a math class? Because if you go in and your view of engagement or teaching and learning isn't what's happening because you haven't shared your vision, then that creates a bigger problem for you, because the teachers will have more protection than you. So it's all about creating a community, really about achieving district goals, and really trying to make an impact on curriculum and instruction as it relates to students. So next week, we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about supervision strategies, how to collect data that's more than just the observation process. So observation is really one way that we supervise and evaluate teachers. And I will tell you that the observation process is one of the best individualized professional development that you can provide a teacher, because it's one-on-one. You're discussing teaching and learning. You're giving individualized feedback that a teacher can use to move forward. So while I say observation is one of the best professional development opportunities that you can provide your staff, it's also not always the most efficient. So if you're trying to have a bigger reach, a bigger impact in a school, you also need to think about more frequent walkthroughs where teachers get a more immediate, quicker feedback in shorter spurts, both positive and formative. I typically won't leave negative feedback during a walkthrough, more questioning or formative in the sense of, I wonder, what was the reason you did this and not this, right? There's a way to kind of frame your dialogue that doesn't put a teacher feeling negative about whatever it is that you observe. You want to be thoughtful about words you use, and we'll talk about that in a little bit when we talk about the observation process. You want to think about how to use your faculty meeting time. If you're standing and just giving information out at a faculty meeting, is that really the best use of the teacher's time? And if that's your vision of leadership, then think about the kind of ways then the teachers are going to act with their students around giving information. So in a faculty meeting, you really want to offer opportunities for professional learning with the staff together. There's data review. So typically schools are looking at data on a continuous cycle. And when you're looking at data, you really need to be asking questions about the data and wondering what is really the underlying cause of the data, both positively and negatively, and saying, what do we need to do to make things different? Or what can we celebrate around our data that things are already working? I mentioned earlier this notion of a professional improvement plan. You'll typically see the words PIP, and whenever you write a professional improvement plan, the goal should be helping the teacher meet with success. And so always offering supports. And again, we'll talk about that later on in the course as how to write a good professional improvement plan. Lesson study is another great activity where you can have teams of teachers studying a lesson, revising it to think how it might go better, and then, of course, observing it in action and talking about what could be done differently the next time. Lesson study is a very effective approach in this whole supervision and evaluation process. Reviewing lesson plans. I will tell you, as a supervisor and someone who's been observing teachers for close to 11 years now, excuse me, almost 12 years, I typically don't ever ask for a lesson plan when I walk in a room, when I observe a teacher, because they're the ones. So if I'm not having a pre-conference and I walk into a classroom, I don't need to see it because the lesson should be clear in terms of the clear beginning, middle, and end. If it's not, I'm typically saying, hey, could I take a look at your lesson plan? Because I'm trying to figure out, what the discrepancy is between their planning and what's actually happening in the classroom. Obviously, you're going to review lesson plans when you are doing a pre-conference so that you can give the teacher feedback prior to them actually teaching the lesson. There's peer coaching, and that can take the place of, the person across the hall, someone in a different grade level, a teacher leader, someone who's an academic coach. There's lots of ways that peers can offer coaching to one another. One of the things I'll just kind of put out there is when you encourage peer coaching, you want to make sure that teachers know what that looks like and how to give feedback to those that are peers. Because they're not administrators, that can be a little bit challenging or uncomfortable for some. And so you really need to create some norms and a culture around safe and productive feedback. For our new teachers, schools should really have an induction program. The state requires that all new teachers in the state of Pennsylvania complete an induction program as part of getting their level 2 certification. So most school districts are certified and approved through the state of Pennsylvania to run their own induction program. It's actually one of the jobs I do. Typically, ours is a 4-day orientation in August, and then monthly meetings from September through May, where we actually spend more in-depth time looking at the Danielson rubrics and what's expected of them as part of the teaching process. We actually meet the first Monday or Tuesday, depending on when Labor Day is, of the second week of school, and our first topic is classroom management. And so the induction program is actually strategically built around the time of the year where teachers are ready or should be focused on a specific domain. And so those of you who've been teaching know that if you don't have strong classroom management by the second week of school, you're pretty much going to be off for the rest of the year. So with our new teachers, we meet 5 days into the year and talk about how's it going, what are some areas you need support with, and giving them some support so that they can get the rest of those 2 weeks under their belt in a secure way. And then, of course, at the last topic in April is assessment, because many new teachers aren't necessarily ready to talk about assessment right off the bat. And so that's typically why we're starting out with classroom management, communication, lesson planning. They're the early topics, whereas differentiation and assessment come later in the year. Of course, all new teachers, untenured teachers are going to get that 82-1 in mid-year of their first, second, and third years, and they'll get it again at the end of the year. Those who are tenured only get an 82-1 once a year at the end. There are certainly opportunities for teachers to do research as part of their supervision plan. So they may not necessarily be observed formally throughout the year, but they are kind of working either collaboratively with a colleague or independently on their own to complete some research on ways that they can improve their practice. And of course, then we have, termination and suspension notice, and typically that's going to lead to what's called a louder mill hearing. Every employee or every teacher is that is a right that they have before being terminated or suspended. That there's a louder mill hearing where the administration, teachers, usually an attorney or two, are talking about evidence towards either teacher misconduct or teacher incompetence or teacher insubordination or something related to that. Of course, we're in the day and age of PBOS, so teachers who are teaching tested subjects have growth scores where they're either dark blue, which is that the teachers show high evidence of exceeding the growth standard from last year to this year. There's a light blue color that looks at the student is showing strong evidence of making growth. There's green, which shows that the teacher's making adequate growth from year to year. Yellow is where we start to see the teacher is not making the adequate growth, and red is really a sign that the teacher has not made the growth standard that's expected for the students. So if you're not in a tested subject, that's an area that you should become familiar with. If you Google PBOS, you can actually go online and they have tutorials on how to understand and make sense of PBOS, both the teacher and the administrative levels. It's all free professional development. I highly encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't had tested subject experience yet. And then, of course, curriculum development. It's always going to be part of supervising and evaluating teachers. So I'm sure there's other things that you could think about that are coming up. And so what we'll do is we'll kind of let that percolate a little bit, because next week we will be discussing those strategies for supervision. So I'm going to tell you to pause here and go to the discussion thread for this week. And by the way, the discussion thread this week is going to be a little bit different because you're going to be adding a few threads that will respond to a couple of questions throughout this slide, as well as the slide presentation, as well as some other activities. And so just really going to use the discussion thread as just a place to show your thinking. So I'm going to ask you to answer this question on a discussion thread for this week. So now that you've had an opportunity to reflect on what makes a good teacher, we're going to kind of zero in to the domains for Charlotte Danielson. And what's nice about the Enhancing Professional Practice framework is that it really provides a common defensible definition of good teaching. So one of the things that I will do with teachers, new teachers, in August as well as throughout the year is really have them dig into those rubrics with administrators and talk about what does it look like to be proficient or distinguished in a specific area of teaching, and what does it not look like. And then I even push them further to say what are some sources of evidence that you would expect to see related to that specific component. Really provides a good opportunity for you to have conversations with teachers around specific areas of teaching, and it's really can provide a tool for professional development. So if you notice, for example, in the beginning of the year, people are struggling with classroom management across the board. That's the time to bring your faculty together and talk about, okay, how are we setting routines for learning, and how do we build stamina for student work? So the framework really provides a nice roadmap for teachers then who could, how do we get better? And so I can tell you that every classroom I walk into, teachers are always going to be at various levels of professional performance. And my job isn't to knock them down, it's to find out where are they on that continuum and how do I move them to the next step. and the like. So you're going to want to be thinking about how to, every lesson you can walk in can be opportunity to say, how am I going to move this teacher forward? And I will tell you, there have been times where I've walked into a lesson that's so exceptionally, or I shouldn't say exceptional, effective in delivering and organizing learning, that sometimes my feedback is to the teacher, you need to seek opportunities to share your practice with your colleagues, because now you are in this leadership role and you can be someone who can even strengthen your practice by then working with your colleagues. Oh, went too far. Hold on a second. So there are 4 domains. Domain 1 is planning and preparation. Domain 2 is classroom environment. Domain 3 is instruction. And domain 4 is professional responsibilities. When I walk into a classroom, I'm typically only focused on domains 1, 2, and 3, just because of the nature of what's happening in the classroom. The professional piece is going to come at play perhaps when you are doing your pre and post conference, or when you're observing the teacher doing other things at professional development or faculty meetings or participating in school events. That's really where you're going to see that. You're going to see domain 1, 2, and 3 showing up in a classroom observation. So the way I just did a screenshot from the book just to kind of make sure everyone's on the same page. There is the domain. So if you look at domain 1, there's planning and preparation, okay? And then in that domain, there's a component. This component is 1E. So this one happens to be designing coherent instruction. And actually there's one little element off on here. You'll see from the component then, that you then have these elements. So the first element is learning activities. The second element is instructional materials and resources. The third element is instructional groups. And there's a 4th one in this domain, and I know that just because I've observed so much, which is structure and pacing, which is really has a teacher planned a clear beginning, middle, and end. You know, is there an objective and the purpose set up? Do the activities align with that objective? And is there closure and assessment at the end of the lesson that matches that beginning and that middle? As oftentimes I'll say to teachers, that's really the I do, we do, you do part of teaching. So you can see the elements of domain 1, demonstrating knowledge of content and pedagogy, demonstrating knowledge of students, setting instructional outcomes. By the way, the setting instructional outcomes, one of the things that I often see as a shortcoming in, especially as the students get up in the grade levels, like secondary levels, where the teacher's not making the actual instructional outcome clear to the students at the start of the lesson. So this is one where I'm saying, what's the purpose of this lesson? And sometimes teachers just go right into the content and don't really say to the student, this is what I want you to learn today, and be able to do. Demonstrating knowledge of resources, designing coherent instruction, which is what I just talked about in the previous slide. And then the last one is how has the teacher designed assessments to assess what students learned as a result of what you planned? So let's talk a little bit about your pre-observation conference and what that should look like. And again, this is what you're going to be doing. You have 2 observations that are due as part of your assessments for this course. So, oops, keep going too fast. So your pre-conference is really going to be an opportunity to get the teacher to focus on their area of professional practice, specifically around 4A, which is reflecting on teaching, or D, participating in a professional community. So having that pre-conference is part of being an educator, right? That you're thinking about and trying to set goals for your own professional development so that 4E, you can grow and develop professionally. And then of course 4F is showing that professionalism, that you can work and take feedback and be in that community and really do something different and have value in that interaction. Typically 4B in the pre-conference, you may be talking about how you're going to collect data during the observation. And 4C might be, so how then will you share with the parents the student's performance with that learning outcome? Those two may or may not always be part of the pre-conference, depending on what it is that the teacher wants you to be focused on for the observation. So what I'm going to do is talk briefly about the 5 domains. So the first one, this is one you're really going to see when you're in the classroom as part of an observation, that idea that you're communicating with students. So how effectively is the teacher doing this work and making the learning clear for the student throughout the lesson? What type of questioning and discussion techniques does the teacher use? And we'll talk about ways to assess that next week, but you're going to want to look at the classroom flow. Is the question always teacher to student, or is there a questioning that's occurring student to student? And is there an opportunity that everyone's engaged in that discussion? And, oh, by the way, you want to make sure that teachers are using wait time. One of the things that you need to be mindful of when you're observing a teacher is there are times where, because you're observing, the teachers can get nervous and their questioning starts to feel very rapid fire like, and that can be somewhat problematic because then you're not giving students an opportunity to process. Some students will need more processing time than others. So you really want to encourage teachers to be good with wait time and student-to-student discussion, not just teacher-to-student discussion. You want to look at how teachers are engaging students in learning, and so you're going to see the term cognitive engagement. So sometimes you'll go into a classroom and everyone is following the teacher's directions and such, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're cognitively engaged. And so what is the teacher doing to ensure that the students' minds are on and focused on the learning? And so typically there should be some active engagement that's going on. 3D, this is where the students know what the assessment criteria is before they complete the work, and the teacher is then monitoring that information throughout the lesson and giving feedback students can use right away. And so that's a strong component of the assessment piece. There's the last element in using assessment in instruction talks about the students contributing towards the assessment criteria, and that's not always, or it's not realistic in many cases, unless you've really done some work to have students understand what something of good quality would be, and in them negotiating that criteria. And then lastly is that demonstrating flexibility and responsiveness. So this is, are you taking advantage of the teachable moment? Are you responding to students throughout the lesson because they're not getting it and you have to adjust? Or is the teacher just plowing right over student response because they want to teach the lesson that they've planned? And so that's one that you want to encourage your teachers to be responsibly teaching. So if they're doing 3D well, then 3E should easily fall suit to that. So I'm going to stop the video right at this point, and I'm going to pick it up with a second video to finish out the rest of this week's content. But on Blackboard, I will have posted the different components to Domain 3. And then what I'm going to ask you to do, and you're going to be paired, is to to look at your component and think about what you would expect to see that would be unsatisfactory at that level for that component. What would you expect to see at the needs improvement level, the proficient, and the distinguished level? So this is something you're going to post to the discussion board with a new thread.